Picture a car running on fumes. No gas station ahead, no exits, no help coming. Just a needle buried so far below empty that the gauge has stopped trying to tell the truth. Now scale that image up. Not one car, an entire country, 11 million people, one island, and a fuel crisis so severe that the government has stopped telling its own citizens how bad it really is. Because here is the number that changes everything. Cuba's oil reserves have dropped to levels so critically low that independent energy analysts are now using a word they almost never use about a functioning nation-state: terminal. Not declining, not struggling, not concerning, terminal. That word carries weight in finance and economics. It does not mean things are difficult. It means the mathematical trajectory has reached a point where recovery without radical external intervention is no longer possible. It means the numbers have stopped being a warning and started being a verdict. And Cuba's oil numbers are delivering that verdict right now. Here is what we know. At the peak of the Venezuela-Cuba oil agreement, Cuba was receiving approximately 100,000 barrels of subsidized oil every single day. That oil powered everything: electricity generation, food transportation, hospital generators, water pumping stations, industrial production, the basic mechanical infrastructure that keeps a modern society functioning. Today, that number has collapsed to somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 barrels per day on the best days, and on many days, the tankers simply do not arrive at all. That is an 85 to 90% reduction in Cuba's primary energy source. Let that percentage land for a moment. Imagine your household income dropped by 85% overnight. Not gradually, not with warning, just gone. And then imagine you had no savings, no credit, no family to borrow from, no alternative income source. That is Cuba's energy situation expressed in human terms. But here is what makes this crisis uniquely devastating from a financial and economic collapse perspective. Oil in Cuba is not just a commodity. It is not just fuel. It is the foundational input that makes every other economic activity possible. Without oil, Cuba cannot generate consistent electricity. Without electricity, Cuba cannot run its food cold storage facilities. Without cold storage, food spoils before it reaches consumers. Without food reaching consumers, you do not have an economic problem anymore. You have a humanitarian catastrophe. And the chain reaction does not stop there. Without oil, Cuba cannot run the trucks that move agricultural produce from farms to cities. Without those trucks, urban populations starve even when rural areas have food. Without oil, Cuba cannot operate its water treatment and pumping infrastructure. Without clean water, you add disease to hunger. The financial and economic collapse experts who study failed states have a term for this sequence. They call it cascading systems failure. And Cuba is in the middle of one right now. But how did it get here? The full story of how Cuba burned through its oil lifeline involves financial decisions, geopolitical betrayals, and a series of economic miscalculations so catastrophic they almost seem deliberate. Almost. What actually happened behind closed doors is far more disturbing than deliberate sabotage. Because the truth is that nobody planned for this. And that makes it so much worse. There was a moment in the early 2000s when Cuba thought it had solved its energy problem forever. Not temporarily, not partially, forever. And for a brief window of time, it almost looked like they were right. To understand how Cuba's oil reserves reached critically low levels today, you need to go back to the relationship that prevented this collapse for 2 full decades. Because without understanding what Cuba had and what it lost, the current crisis makes no sense financially or economically. The year is 2000. Hugo Chavez has just taken power in Venezuela. He is ideologically electrified, revolutionary, deeply hostile to American capitalism, and sitting on top of the largest proven oil reserves on planet Earth. Venezuela at that moment held approximately 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, more than Saudi Arabia, more than any other nation on Earth. an almost incomprehensible amount of stored energy wealth sitting beneath Venezuelan soil. And Chavez had a vision for what to do with it. He would use Venezuelan oil as a geopolitical weapon, not a military weapon, an economic one. He would build a network of allied nations across Latin America and the Caribbean, bound together not by military treaties, but by energy dependency. Nations that received Venezuelan oil at subsidized prices would owe Venezuela political loyalty and strategic alignment. Cuba was the crown jewel of that vision. The financial arrangement they constructed together was unlike anything in modern economic history. Cuba would receive up to 100,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day at prices dramatically below international market rates. In some periods, Cuba was paying as little as 40% of the actual market price for its oil. The remaining 60% was essentially a gift, a subsidy, a transfer of Venezuelan national wealth directly into Cuba's economic survival. In exchange, Cuba sent Venezuela something Venezuela desperately needed but could not produce itself: human capital. Thousands of Cuban doctors deployed across Venezuela's poorest communities, providing healthcare to populations that had never had reliable medical access. Cuban military advisors embedded in Venezuelan security services. Cuban intelligence operatives helping Chavez, and later Maduro, identify and neutralize political opposition. From a pure financial analysis perspective, this was an extraordinarily clever arrangement for Cuba. Cuba was trading services it could produce at almost zero marginal cost, doctors it had already trained, advisors it was already paying, for an energy subsidy worth billions of dollars annually. The numbers were staggering. At peak oil prices, the Venezuelan subsidy to Cuba was worth somewhere between $4 and $6 billion per year, every single year, flowing into an economy whose entire GDP hovered around $10 billion. Cuba was receiving energy transfers worth nearly half its entire economic output annually for years. This is the financial foundation that the entire Cuban economy was built on during the 2000s and early 2010s. Not productivity, not exports, not tourism alone, Venezuelan oil. And here is the economic collapse warning sign that analysts were raising for years that Havana completely ignored. An economy built on a single external subsidy from a single unstable partner is not an economy. It is a dependency. And dependencies have an expiration date determined entirely by the health of the provider. When Venezuela's own economy began its catastrophic collapse, driven by falling oil prices, devastating mismanagement, rampant corruption, and the flight of the skilled petroleum engineers who actually knew how to run the industry, Cuba's lifeline began to fray. Venezuelan oil production fell from 3 million barrels a day to under 800,000. The oil available to send to Cuba shrank proportionally. The subsidized shipments that had kept Cuba alive dropped from 100,000 barrels a day to 60,000, then 40,000, then 20,000, then into the devastating single-digit territory where Cuba finds itself today. But here is what nobody has reported clearly until now: the exact moment when Cuban government officials realized this collapse was permanent and irreversible, not temporary, not fixable, not something that would bounce back with the next oil cycle. There was a specific meeting, a specific date, a specific document. And what was said in that meeting and what was decided explains every desperate economic decision Cuba has made in the 3 years since. We know what happened in that room, and it will change everything you think you understand about why Cuba's crisis accelerated so suddenly and so completely. Some moments in history happen in public. Speeches, elections, protests, declarations. The whole world watches and records and remembers. But the moments that actually change history, the real turning points, almost always happen in a room with no cameras, no journalists, no public record. Just tired people, terrible numbers, and a decision that cannot be undone. For Cuba, that moment came in the spring of 2023. a closed emergency session between senior Cuban Energy Ministry officials and their Venezuelan counterparts in Havana. No press, no public announcement, no official record that this meeting ever took place. But it did take place. And what was presented inside that room was a technical energy assessment so devastating that several Cuban officials reportedly refused to believe the numbers the first time they saw them. The Venezuelan representatives laid out the cold financial and engineering reality of their own oil infrastructure. Production wells that had not been maintained in years were declining at rates that could not be reversed without billions of dollars of investment that Venezuela did not have. Refining capacity had dropped so severely that Venezuela was struggling to process its own domestic consumption. The tanker fleet that had been delivering oil to Cuba was aging, under-maintained, and shrinking through attrition. The Venezuelans told the Cubans directly, "We cannot guarantee you 20,000 barrels per day going forward. We cannot guarantee you 10,000. We cannot give you a number at all because we do not know ourselves what we will be able to produce month to month." The structured, subsidized oil relationship that had sustained Cuba for 23 years was not being reduced. It was being declared functionally over. The financial implications of that statement for Cuba were immediate and catastrophic. Remember the economic dependency we established in Part 2. Cuba had structured its entire energy economy around Venezuelan oil. It had not built serious alternative energy infrastructure. It had not developed domestic oil production. It had not established relationships with alternative suppliers at commercial rates because it had no foreign currency to pay commercial rates. Cuba had put every single energy egg into one Venezuelan basket for over 2 decades, and that basket had just told them it was empty. Now, here is where the economic collapse mechanics become truly devastating in ways that go beyond simple energy shortage. Oil in modern economics is what analysts call a foundational commodity. It is not one input among many. It is the input that makes all other inputs function. When a country loses foundational commodity access, the economic damage does not happen linearly. It happens exponentially. Lose 50% of your oil, and you do not lose 50% of your economic output. You lose 70%, 80%, sometimes more. Because the losses compound across every interconnected system simultaneously. Cuba's electricity grid began failing within weeks of the Venezuelan supply dropping below critical thresholds. Not gradually, suddenly. Power cuts went from 4 hours per day to 8 hours, then to 12, then to 18. In some provinces, to 22 hours of darkness every single day. And when electricity fails in an economy, everything fails with it. Cold storage for food, gone. Medical equipment in hospitals, failing. Water pumping infrastructure, shutting down. Communications, fragmenting. Industrial production, stopping entirely. The financial cost of these cascading failures was calculated by one independent economic research group studying Cuba at approximately $3 billion in lost economic activity in a single 12-month period. $3 billion in an economy already generating only $10 to $12 billion annually. A 25 to 30% economic contraction driven almost entirely by the loss of one commodity from one partner country. But here is the part of this story that the financial press has completely missed. After that meeting in spring 2023, the Cuban government made a series of emergency economic decisions that were supposed to be secret. Desperate financial maneuvers designed to buy time while they searched for alternative oil sources and alternative financing. Those maneuvers were not secret. They were discovered. And what they reveal about how close Cuba actually came to a complete financial system collapse in 2023 and 2024, information that has never been publicly reported, is more alarming than anything in the official narrative. Because Cuba did not just lose its oil, it tried to replace it. And what happened when it tried? The countries it approached, the deals it attempted, the financial instruments it used in desperation, tells a story of a government running out of options so fast it was willing to risk everything on moves that had almost no chance of working. One of those moves almost worked, until it didn't. And the fallout from that failure is the hidden reason Cuba's reserves are where they are today. When a government gets desperate enough, it stops thinking long-term. It stops calculating consequences. It stops asking whether something will work. It only asks one question: will it buy us time? And in 2023 and 2024, the Cuban government was asking that question about every financial and energy deal it could find, knocking on every door, calling every contact, offering whatever it had left to offer in exchange for one thing: oil. Just enough oil to keep the lights on for another month. Let me take you through exactly what Cuba tried, because the sequence of failed deals that followed that spring 2023 meeting is one of the most extraordinary financial desperation stories in modern economic history, and almost none of it has been reported accurately in the mainstream press. The first call went to Russia. Logical on the surface, Russia is one of the world's largest oil producers. Russia has deep historical ties to Cuba, stretching back to the Soviet era. Russia is currently engaged in maximum confrontation with the United States and its Western allies, making Cuba a potentially attractive geopolitical partner to support and supply. Cuba approached Moscow with a specific proposal: oil deliveries at subsidized rates in exchange for Cuban political support at the United Nations, expanded Russian military access to Cuban territory, and intelligence sharing arrangements that would give Russia better visibility into American military activities in the Caribbean. It was a significant offer. Russia said no. Not because Russia lacked the oil — Russia has oil — but because Russia is fighting a war in Ukraine that is consuming its financial resources, its logistical capacity, and its political bandwidth at an unprecedented rate. Diverting tankers, subsidizing a Caribbean island economy, and managing a complex new supply relationship while simultaneously running a major land war in Europe was simply beyond what Moscow could operationally manage. Russia sent sympathy, sent some diplomatic support, sent a few token gestures. It did not send oil at the scale Cuba needed. The second call went to China. This one looked even more promising on paper. China has been aggressively expanding its economic and strategic footprint across Latin America for years. Cuba sits 90 miles from the United States, prime real estate from a Chinese strategic intelligence perspective. China has the financial resources to absorb the cost of subsidizing Cuban oil imports without even noticing it on its national balance sheet. But China had history with Cuba. Bad history. China had invested heavily in Cuban economic partnerships throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Infrastructure projects, agricultural development, industrial partnerships. Billions of dollars of Chinese capital flowing into Cuban state enterprises with promised returns and production targets. Almost none of those projects delivered what was promised. Cuban state enterprises took Chinese investment, missed every production target, defaulted on payment schedules, and delivered excuse after excuse wrapped in revolutionary rhetoric that Beijing had absolutely no patience for. China is a nation that makes cold financial calculations. Ideology does not enter the room when Beijing evaluates investment decisions. The Cuban file inside Chinese economic ministries showed one clear thing: Cuba was not a partner. Cuba was a black hole for capital. China declined to provide meaningful oil support. Now here is where Cuba's desperation took a turn that shocked even the analysts who study economic collapse for a living. Cuba turned to the international spot market, the open ocean of global oil trading, where any buyer with hard currency can purchase oil from any seller at current market prices. No political relationships required, no subsidies, no favors, just dollars for barrels. The problem was that Cuba had almost no dollars, so Cuba did something that revealed exactly how close to the financial edge it was standing. It began liquidating assets. State-owned properties in Havana that had been held by the Cuban government for decades, hotels, commercial real estate, industrial facilities, were quietly offered to foreign buyers through third-party intermediaries in Panama and Spain. Cuban government officials denied these sales were happening, but the financial paper trail told a different story. Transactions that analysts tracked through Caribbean financial networks showed Cuban state assets moving into foreign hands at prices well below market value. Cuba was conducting a fire sale of its own national property to buy oil on the spot market. And even that was not enough, because the quantities of oil Cuba could afford to purchase with the proceeds of these asset sales lasted weeks, sometimes days, and then the power went out again. But here's the development that even the most pessimistic Cuba watchers did not predict. In late 2024, a deal was quietly structured between Cuba and a consortium of private energy traders operating through intermediaries in 3 different countries, a complex financial arrangement involving deferred payment structures, partial asset collateralization, and political guarantees that pushed the boundaries of what international financial regulations technically permit. It was creative, it was desperate, and for about 4 months it actually worked. Oil began arriving in Cuba at volumes that briefly stabilized the power grid. Blackouts shortened, the government announced cautious optimism, state media ran stories about energy stabilization. And then the deal collapsed. One of the intermediary companies involved in the financing structure came under investigation by European financial regulators for sanctions violation concerns. The entire payment chain froze overnight. The oil stopped, the tankers turned around mid-journey. And Cuba found itself worse off than before the deal, because it had used up the last of its liquidatable assets to structure the collateral for a deal that fell apart before it could deliver lasting relief. The reserves that had briefly stabilized crashed back down to the critically low levels where they sit today, leaving Cuba with almost nothing left to offer any potential partner. No assets to sell, no currency to spend, no credit to borrow against, no allies willing to carry the weight. Just an island, a desperate government, and reserves that analysts now measure not in months, not in weeks, but in days. And what the Cuban government is now being forced to consider, the final option that every previous Cuban leader swore would never happen, is so historically significant that when it becomes public, it will dominate global financial and geopolitical news for months. We're going to tell you exactly what that option is and why, despite everything, it might actually be Cuba's only real path back from the edge. Cuba has run out of roads. Every alternative has been tried, every deal has collapsed, every ally has turned away, every financial maneuver has failed, and the oil reserves are still falling. So what happens now? There is one door left. One option that every Cuban leader since 1959 swore would never happen. One solution that the entire revolutionary identity of this government was built to prevent. Cuba must talk to the United States. Not symbolically, not diplomatically, practically, transactionally, with specific offers on the table and specific demands in return. The financial logic is undeniable. America has oil. America has capital. America has the power to lift the sanctions that cost Cuba $4 to $5 billion annually. America has 2.5 million Cuban Americans with accumulated wealth and a deep emotional connection to the island they left behind. Everything Cuba needs exists 90 miles away. The only thing standing between Cuba and that lifeline is 65 years of ideology. And here is the brutal economic reality that makes this moment truly historic. Ideology does not power turbines. Ideology does not fuel trucks. Ideology does not feed children. The Cuban government can keep its revolutionary identity, or it can keep its people alive. It cannot do both. The oil reserves have made that choice unavoidable. The numbers have delivered their final verdict. And Cuba is running out of time to respond.